Welcome to Reclaiming Sexuality from Religion. Glad you're all here. And just to start it out, I just want us to maybe meet each other, say hi to 2 or 3 people, maybe say what your religious background was. It could be undecided, no religion, not sure, and where you are right now, just to kind of get a flavor. So just a minute or two. A couple sentences if you want. All right, glad you could all come out tonight. Thank you very much. This is Reclaiming Sexuality from Religion. I'm Andrew Jasko. I'm studying here to get a doctorate in clinical psychology. And I was formerly a Pentecostal Assemblies of God Christian minister. And then I was a Presbyterian minister. And I also did some missionary work in India. But we'll get into that a little bit. Just first, I want to say a couple things. This right here is really what it all comes down to, is self-love and loving yourself. And I really believe that self-love is the heart of healing. And a lot of us have been taught to hate and to repress a part of ourselves, the most core of our humanity, which is our sexuality. And so really learning to love ourselves again is the core of healing. And we're going to talk about abuse and religious harm tonight, and violation and some kind of intense things. But that's not what sex is about. Sex is about the celebration of love and the creation of life. It's about connection, giving, growth, exploration, spirituality, and love. All of these really positive, wonderful things. And that's what reclaiming sexuality means. And so I just want to encourage you to self-care tonight. There may be some difficult topics that we go over, and maybe like a memory or something will come up for you. And so we have a bathroom right in the middle of the hall right there if you need to step out. But I just encourage you to try to sit with those emotions and memories. That's part of healing trauma. And hopefully we're going to have fun too, so it won't be all serious. And those kinds of things will pass. And tonight we're just going to open up the issues, and my hope is that you'll all be able to take something home specific to your journey. And I mean, I've been studying this for a while. There's so much. It's a massive, massive topic. We could just talk about one small slice about it and write books on it. And those books need to be written. They really do. And we're going to be recording this part of it, but we're going to have some discussion opportunities, and at the end an optional sharing and Q&A, so that will be confidential. We're not going to be taping anyone. And just a note on confidentiality too. If you're sharing anything, just be mindful of what people are sharing. And also maybe if you see someone out in the community, you might not want to say, hey, so I had the sex talk last night. How was that for you? Or I heard you're leaving your religion. Did you tell your family? They might not necessarily be comfortable with that. So just being aware of that. And my background is evangelical Christianity, and I'm mostly going to be talking about religion from that perspective. I'll also be covering the Judeo-Christian religions more broadly, and I won't be speaking that much out of that realm because I don't really feel that I have the expertise to speak on those. But I think if you do come from those traditions, you have knowledge of those, you'll probably see some themes emerging that run across the religions. And if there are differences, I mean, I want to know. I'm really curious to continue learning about that. And so you might say, I'm currently religious. I'm not sure, there could be a variety of people here. Or you might say, I had a really positive experience of sexuality in my religious background. And that's great. I'm happy to celebrate sex positivity wherever it happens, including in religion. And the intention of this talk isn't to tear down religion per se. But this is a place to voice religious harm and to name religious abuses. So I don't feel the need to mince words or spare any words. I don't feel that anyone should here too. And for people who do identify with a religious tradition, these are good things to be aware of. these are real teachings and real experiences that people have. And if you are part of a congregation, probably people in that congregation have had these kinds of experiences. So even if some of these things might be offensive or might not sit well, that's okay. You can disagree with everything and walk away with that. But realize this is a conversation that's going on, and I think we need to have more awareness about it so we know how to address it, whatever we conclude about it. All right, so I'm going to share my story in the hopes that this will jog your memory and think about your story or your experience and open up the issue a little bit. So this is me in India 5 years ago. I'm in a village church in India. There are Bible leaders and ministers in this church. I'm giving them a message about world evangelism, that they should go and risk their lives for the gospel and evangelize their various tribes and people groups. And I was in India with the intention of training indigenous leaders to go reach their Hindu and Muslim families and convert them to Jesus and bring about the second coming of Jesus Christ. That was my career goal. So I'm kind of ambitious, but so that's what I was up to just a couple years ago. And this is me at Princeton Seminary. That's where I got my Master of Divinity degree. I was an arduous student of Scripture. I really wanted to be a person of the Bible, so I went to seminary to learn the Bible in the original Greek and Hebrew languages and really get an idea of its historical context. And I was graduating that year and preaching a message to my classmates who were also graduating to go out and be ministers and chaplains and things like that. And I was telling them, hey, everybody, we need to go take world evangelism seriously. Like, this gospel thing is still relevant because a lot of people weren't so sure or weren't as into evangelism, got some pushback. I was like, this is what we need to do. And that was in 2014. And this is me 2 months later at Burning Man. So you might be asking, what happened to you? And honestly, I ask myself that question pretty much every single day. But a lot has happened to me in this time period. And people use this phrase, fallen from grace, or fallen into sin, specifically to refer to ministers who start being sexually active in an unsanctioned way. And they have to be disciplined and removed from their positions of authority. Just interesting, that terminology. Fallen into sin means sexual activity. So, I grew up in the Pentecostal church, the Assemblies of God, it's called. A very fundamentalist, takes the Word of God literally, believes in world evangelism and a personal experience of God. My father started a church pretty much right after I was born. So I was raised to be this leader in the church with this massive vision of participating in world evangelism. And I took it very seriously my entire life. I remember when I was 5 years old, I was crying out to God in bed saying, I want to see 1 billion souls come to Jesus. So I was an ambitious little kid too. And so I saw myself almost as this like Jason Bourne of Christianity figure. I was totally devoted. I mean, I went to church multiple times a week. Everything was about God and my relationship with God. And I went to Wheaton College, an evangelical school, to study Bible, theology, and ministry, and evangelism. And I ended up being a minister for about a year. I went on some missionary trips to India and was a minister for a year in the Presbyterian church as well. So I've kind of been all across the board in Christianity, or a lot of evangelical Christianity. But during this whole time, I really struggled tremendously on the inside, internally. I had a big conflict. I struggled a lot with anxiety, massive amounts of anxiety, and I had no idea why. I had absolutely no idea why. And I also struggled a lot with sexuality. And that eventually led me to leave my religion. I remember one of my first sexual experiences. I was just about the age of puberty. And I was at a sleepover at a friend's house, and this guy started touching me, and it felt good. But I was really afraid, because I didn't know what was going on. Something sexual was going on, and also it was something that was same-sex. And I knew that if I turned out to be gay, I would go to hell. Like, that would be really, really bad. So I was terrified. I didn't know what was going on. And I was like, what? I had this fear for years. What if I end up being gay? Because that would mean hell, and that would mean I would lose my ministry job. Later on I learned that like same-sex touch is around puberty. That stuff is really common. It doesn't mean anything about orientation. And if it did, so what? Who cares? But I just had that early experience of total terror around that early event. I really remember that. And I remember I went to something called the youth group. Have any of you been a part of youth groups? Okay. Yeah, so the youth group is basically in a Christian indoctrination for adolescents growing up. And it also serves as like a counterculture for secular society. So kids who are going through high school and having all these wild, crazy hormones have a group to go to keep them from being sexually active. Because if you become sexually active, you might become like these people in the world. You might fall into sin, or do sex, drugs, and rock and roll. You know, all the fun things that everyone else is doing. So I remember it was incredibly isolating, that time period for me, because I wanted to fit in so badly. I just wanted to be like everyone else, and I wanted to be sexual. But I was taught that being sexually active was really dangerous. It's dangerous to my salvation. So we were often taught if things started getting sexy and you were in a relationship, then the right thing to do is to leave that relationship and devote yourself to Jesus. So I remember, talk about a miserable dating experience. It was horrible. There's just so many things like this. And I started to view my sexuality as a curse from God. And I prayed, God, please take away my sexuality. Just take it away. Because I recognized that sex was a source of nothing but misery for me. In fact, it was a source of, it was really dangerous. There was nothing good about sex until this day of salvation where I might get married someday in the future. But until then, it's just all bad. It's all harmful. So I thought it was a curse. I hated my sexuality. I tried to get rid of it as much as I could, but we all know how that goes. And so I ended up having sex when I was 26 or 27, I think, when I was in seminary the first time. And I remember, like, it was so challenging. So challenging. And for about the first year that I was sexually active, I disassociated from my body. I couldn't stay in my body just because of all those years of guilt and shame and fear. It took me a long time to learn how to be sexual and not be afraid. And so eventually what happened to me was when I was in graduate school, I was just desperate to be healthy. And I realized I'm miserable. I can't live under anxiety anymore and all this fear that I have. And so I made a commitment. I said to myself, I'm going to do whatever it takes to get rid of fear in my life. You could call that a prayer, and I'll trust that God will keep me. It turns out that didn't work out the way I thought it might. And I began to see that teachings in the Bible were the source of my distress. A lot of guilt, shame, and fear and judgment, and also with sexuality specifically. That was a big issue. So I had a slow, painful, rude awakening. I never would have in a million years thought I would have left Christianity. No way. But I ended up leaving and moving up to California, packing all my stuff in my car after this huge life crisis. And now I'm here writing about religious abuses and healing from religious trauma. So that's where I'm at today. So how common is this thing? Just out of curiosity, how many people in this room were raised religious? Okay, so most of us. And this is pretty, this reflects pretty much the national average. My story might sound extreme, like some kind of crazy cult or something, and it is extreme, but it's normal. It's really prevalent. Religious fundamentalism is probably the most dominant ideology in the world today. in our world. And in our country, it's incredibly prevalent too. The Bay Area is a little bit of an anomaly. It's a little bit of a bubble. But religiosity, about 77% of people in the U.S. consider themselves religious. 9 out of 10 Americans were raised religious. And of those, about a full third, 35%, consider themselves evangelical or born-again Christians, which is specifically my version that I'm talking about. So these are really commonplace things. This isn't some extreme cult. This is literally the church on the corner in every city in the country. And really, I think that religious sexual teachings might be the most prevalent form of sexual abuse in the world. These ideologies and teachings that teach people to reject and repress the core of their humanity, their sexuality. That's a kind of psychological sexual abuse. And this data comes from a Pew study called America's Changing Landscape. I recommend it. It's a really good read if you're into this kind of thing. So I crunched some numbers here, and I estimate that about 50 to 70% of Americans identify with conservative religious views about sexuality as well. So again, very prevalent. All right, well, how do we reclaim our sexuality from religion? A couple questions I want us to ask tonight. And I also have pen and paper in the back there if you want to take notes or at any time. There's a couple things. First of all, identify what happened. A lot of us grew up with tons of indoctrination, and it just was being piled on, and it's easy to just kind of live in that aftermath and never unpack it and say, well, what actually took place and what's the impact of that? So that's what we're going to spend most of our time looking at. Number 2, how did this impact me today? And just as we're going through, I'd encourage you to write down any questions or think about that. Or if we go over something and you're like, ooh, I feel that in my body, or there's a memory there. There might be certain issues that surprise you that say, okay, this is still a relevant issue for me. Maybe other issues, I'm not so sure. And then, number 3, explore what can I do to heal and to flourish, because that's what sexuality is about. It's about flourishing. It's about life. And you might say, well, I have no religious background, or I am still religious. Well, my advice is to ask these questions: identify, observe, and explore. Because the point is that we're going to see that this is in the culture. We live in a culture that was birthed in and it continues to be informed by religious sexual norms. So this stuff is everywhere, regardless of your religious position or lack of exposure to religion. So I've read through the Bible, I have no idea how many different times, and I've been studying this topic for quite a while. And I've been searching really hard for sex-positive teachings. Where are the constructive scriptures on sexuality? And I really haven't found that many. I mean, but seriously, like, why aren't there Jesus' tips on miraculous oral sex? Or like the 10 commandments of a supernatural sex life. Thou shalt practice consent. Thou shalt have fun. I mean, seriously, why is this stuff not in there? I don't get it. But instead of consent, side note, we do see something called mutual submission, where wives and husbands are commanded to submit their bodies to each other. So it's the submission base. I need this now of you. This is my role, duty. I'm not really into that. So why does religion tend towards repressing sexuality? This is the heart of the matter. There's several different reasons. The separation of church and state as we know it is a recent historical innovation. For most of history, religion and state have been one and the same thing. And this is partly positive too. Like, religions tended to provide people protection often. Like, often the government couldn't do that, and the church or whatever religion helped people, gave them food, protected them from foreign invasion, and to settle disputes. But, I mean, usually religious rulers mandated their state religion. And people didn't get to choose what religion they were. They were born in it, or they got conquered in a war, and then another religion took its place, and you had to be that religion. And so religions were charged with legislating morality. And what happened is we had religious ideology mixing with civic legislation. The two get confused and conflated. So if I do something wrong to my neighbor, it's not just a civil offense, it's a divine offense. And there's divine judgment attached to it. And this whole thing gets blown up into divine punishments and divine rewards. And so there's sex legislation, and this is why we see people getting stoned or killed for committing adultery, which is also commanded in the Bible and the Old Testament. But things like this, these were actually enforced because that was the way it was. So separation of church and state is a great thing. Then sex is about reproduction. Reproduction, physical reproduction, and also reproduction of the religion. There's something known as the creation mandate and the creation myth. I'll read this in Genesis 1. It says, God blessed Adam and Eve and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, have sex and make babies, and dominate the earth, which is very interesting. Rule over and dominate the plants and the animal kingdom. So we see here that reproduction is a means of religious expansion, and it continues to be that way in the world today. A lot of religions reproduce through physical reproduction. And specifically, they're expanding God's kingdom through sexual reproduction. And really, the Great Commission, which is a command to make disciples of all nations, it's almost like a religious reproduction system. It's like religion's way of having sex and reproducing itself now. It's not just through physical babies. It's through converting people to the ideology of an authoritarian king. That's the way the religion reproduces. But anyway, that's a little bit of a sidetrack. Sex is mostly about physical reproduction. So we need babies. We need to increase and continue a godly society in the world. And out of this, we get heterosexism. Because anything that doesn't create babies, it's kind of, well, what's the point? It doesn't really do anything. So because of that, you have things like anal sex or oral sex or kink. They're unsanctioned territory. They don't create babies. So in a lot of religions, any of this variety or homosexuality, it doesn't result in babies directly. So again, it gets put off in this no reproduction thing. And then we have Jesus. Jesus here says that at the resurrection, people aren't going to marry, and they're not going to be given in marriage. They're going to be like angels. They're going to be asexual. So hallelujah, there's going to be no sex and party. It's just going to be one long worship service party. I'm so glad I'm not going there. But I mean, this is the vision. And sex is seen as something that's of the world. It's not eternal. And really what matters at the end of the day is what lasts forever. What's eternal and what's spiritual. And sex is just like, well, we know we need it, and we need to increase the human race and godly society. But the people who are really serious about God don't get into that. They don't get bogged down into this worldly stuff. They're about the things of God. And so sex can be a distraction from that. It's a temptation. It's something that leads you away from the spiritual things. It's unspiritual. Celibacy. So not having sex becomes the example, the pinnacle of spirituality. And religious leaders start getting commanded to be celibate. And look at Jesus. Why is there a virgin birth? Why was Jesus celibate? Why is denial of sexuality like the ideal? I mean, because really sex can be almost like an anti-God force. Again, it's this worldly, earthly thing. And a lot of what happens here is that through sexual repression, sexual energy gets redirected to the service of religious institutions and authorities. That's the power of celibacy. And I think that there probably is such a thing as a positive celibate spiritual practice. A lot of people benefit from that. But as far as I know, those kinds of practices tend to work with sexual energy and to use it. Whereas this is often based on a denial and rejection of sexuality, this kind of celibacy, because it's worldly, it's earthly, it can get you into sin, all that yucky stuff. And we see here the Apostle Paul says in 1 Corinthians, it's good for a man to have sexual relations with his wife, but that's a confession, that's kind of for you weak people. I don't command that. And I wish all of you were like me, the celibate apostle guy. But if you can't control yourself, if you have to have sex, go ahead and get married. Because it's better for you to marry than to burn with passion, or burn in hell, I guess, presumably. And then Jesus says, he says, some people are born eunuchs, and some people have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of God. If you can receive this, receive it. And by the way, people have taken that literally, this making yourself eunuch, throughout the millennia. Because Jesus doesn't make a disclaimer. He's not like, oh, by the way, this is a metaphor. And even if it is, I mean, a metaphor, being a metaphorical eunuch, I don't like that metaphor. But we have the idea, too, that sex is dirty, sex is sinful. How many of you were taught this, or something like this? Sex is taught as this carnal, fleshly thing. Again, the Apostle Paul, he says, be decent, don't do hard partying, waste your life, don't get drunk and do hard drugs. I'm paraphrasing the scriptures for you. And don't do bad sexual things. Don't think about how to gratify the desires of the flesh. When he says sexual immorality, it's just like unsanctioned sex. Anything outside of marriage, essentially. So, wasting your life doing bad partying, doing hard drugs, and then we have sex. Why is it linked together with these addictive behaviors? Why is it treated like an addiction? Something that's dirty, worldly, fleshly. I don't know, that's interesting. We have the doctrine of original sin. This, I think, is maybe the most pernicious, damaging doctrine I've ever come across. When people come out of religion, it's really takes a while to heal this. This is the teaching that we are born sinful. Something about our nature, our most essential humanity, is evil and tends towards rebellion and wickedness. That's our fundamental nature and inclination, is to do bad, is badness. And there's plenty of Bible verses for this. Every inclination of the human heart is evil from childbirth. Genesis. Sin entered the world through Adam, and death through sin, and in this way death came to all people because all sin. So, sin is passed on, original sin, through reproduction, like a sexually transmitted disease. And it's traced along birth. We're born into the world with sin. Our hearts are evil since childhood. It's passed on through our progenitors. So there's this connection between sin and sex that's foundational, this core of who we are, our sexuality, and everything else. There's this dark inclination. And this is so backwards. I mean, what mother has a child and thinks, with a newborn child, this thing is evil and wicked and deserves to be punished? I would hope that a mother would think, this is a beautiful baby, deserving of all the best things in the world, good and pure. Right? That's the instinct, not this original sin stuff. It's so backwards. And what this ends up being about is shame. Sin and shame. This whole sin nature thing is shaming sexuality. And we start to internalize these messages and say, well, sex is bad, sexuality is bad. I'm bad for being sexual. And shame is saying that because there's something wrong on some level, And so there's something sacred about sexuality, something very pure and foundational about it. And do we need to regulate the sexuality of the cosmos in order to maintain its morality? So I wonder, like, this whole universe is going wild with sex, and oh no, we better fix it and make a big rule book for everybody. I mean, the animal kingdom, it all seems to work out somehow. And I wonder if some of this shame and judgment stuff doesn't end up creating more immorality, being counterproductive. I mean, obviously we need to have some kind of civic society, right? But maybe this is a little too far. All right, so why religion tends to repress sexuality? This gets into the control issue. In some ways, you could say that sexual energy, this cosmic sexuality, is like God, or this God force. Because sex created everything. This reproductive life stuff that's happening out there, and in here, and in everything, is this creative force, this creative energy. And so when we have something that's called God, God is claiming, I created everything. And therefore, I can tell you what to do with your body and how to behave sexually. It's this kind of authoritarian takeover of sexuality. Whereas sexuality is this free individual thing, this personal thing. And when you claim to have power over it, you can really control people on a very deep level because it's so fundamental. And I think it's interesting too, sexually empowered people tend to be hard to control. I mean, look at the 1960s with this free love thing that was going on, and people were questioning all kinds of authorities and all kinds of movements, and a lot of power systems didn't like that because people who understand their creative power and have access to this part of themselves tend to be hard to control.
Might have been the acid that helped with that movement.
There are various
factors. I had to say it. I mean, you know, sorry.
Yeah, I'm not going to argue with you on that. We'll save that topic for another discussion.
Okay.
It's a great one, though. I like it. So really, there's a lot of mind control that happens here, and it really is mind control. I've really been looking into this, and I get shocked at how sinister it ends up being. We have thought crimes in these religious systems. It's not even primarily about sexual behavior. It's a matter of sexual fantasy. And because everything has to be done in obedience to the deity. And obedience at the level of the heart, the emotion, the way we spend our time, everything. So God ends up being a sex police in this system. He's watching with his all-seeing eye, looking out. Did you think a sexual thought? I mean, apparently voyeurism is his thing. But like it says in the Bible, in Jeremiah 17, I, the Lord, search the heart and examine the mind to pay back everyone for what they've done. That's spooky. And in 2 Corinthians, we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. So we have confession out of this. Now, probably most of us who grew up in a religious system had some experience of confessing our sins to some other person. And that can be embarrassing or humiliating. But that's not even the primary form of confession. This is far worse. The idea here is that God lives inside your brain. God becomes this kind of a psychological implant, a construct. It's placed inside there, almost like a surveillance camera by a religious system. He's always watching you. Everything you do, every thought you think, it better be in conformity to this system's way, or else you are in danger, you're in jeopardy. And what happens here is this creates massive amounts of anxiety and this whole obsessive-compulsive behavior, this obsessive-compulsive ritual of confessing. Every time I think a bad thought, oh no, I'm unsafe. I could come under judgment. I better get rid of that thought. I better confess it. I better go back to the religious system through confession, through prayer, through hard work, through doing good things. But these good things end up reinforcing the very guilt that they created in the first place. So it's cyclical, it's controlling. And add injury to insult, these thought and emotional crimes are associated with hellfire torture, with the worst form of punishment imaginable. The whole point of hell is that it's the worst thing you could possibly think of. It's the worst imaginable fear. That's why it's there. That's why it was created, this idea. And Jesus takes it there. Unfortunately, this is probably the historical Jesus, according to historical Jesus studies. But anyway, I think he was a great guy in a lot of ways, but he was still a man of his times. He says, "You've heard that it was said, 'Don't commit adultery,' but I tell you, if you lust after a woman in your heart, you've already committed adultery in your heart. It's better for you, and if your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out, throw it away. It's better for you to lose a part of your body than for your whole body to go to hell." So he goes to castration too. He implies castration here. Why does he have to go there? I don't know. But he takes this idea of sexual deviance to a radical extreme. It's not just behavior that'll get you, it's fantasy. So it's a total repression of sexuality. Anything. And you could go to hell. So sex is dangerous. It's life-threatening. Sex is life-threatening. And, I mean, this is bad. We think about this. Think about what's happening in the brain. There's a direct association every time we think of sexual thought. Hell, sex, torture, fire torture. That is as abusive as I can possibly imagine sexual abuse getting. It's really, really, really cruel. And it's everywhere. It's rampant, this ideology. And no wonder people are guilty. No wonder people are struggling or we have difficulty getting over this kind of a fear and guilt and association. So how do we work with this thing? How do we deal with this kind of trauma and fear? We internalize these messages that we hear, and God becomes like a third voice in our head saying, "You're bad, don't do this, don't do that." And we don't even need a teacher or a church anymore because we have this voice on repeat always going on. And this also happens too outside of religion with any kind of societal messaging. People just internalize it and think it's them. It's me. This is just the way I am. This is the way it is. I'm bad at this. I suck at that. It's this third voice, this really cruel slave master judge voice. And I don't know about you, but when I have these kinds of voices in my head, it's really hard to fight them in the moment. I tend to believe them, and they tend to really hurt. So reframing it, I think, really helps. Instead of trying to fight it in the moment, I think of it as monster talk. So it's the idea monster. Oh, so that's the idea monster again, talking to my head. That's not me. It's separating because it isn't you. These are things that we've been taught. They're not natural. They're not a part of us. And we start to think like, oh, that's my monster. It takes the power, the bite away a little bit. And we develop a different relationship with our thoughts, just labeling it, not fighting it, just thinking about it differently. The point is to kind of make the monster more like a teddy bear. It's something like, oh, that's cute, that's happening again. And then we can start to deal with it differently and heal from it in other contexts. So I want to ask you just for a moment, maybe write or think, if you don't have anything to write, like what are a couple monster talk ideas that you've heard, maybe related to sexuality or religion? Just take a minute and maybe go over a couple of them. All right, anybody want to share anything? Just like a sentence or whatever? Yeah?
Being a female, sexual activity devalues you. You don't have as much worth. Yeah.
Right. So feminine sexuality, which we're going to get into, by the way. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's huge. Thank you.
Being a slut is bad.
Being a slut is bad. And even you're a slut because you're sexual.
Don't masturbate.
Don't masturbate. I remember thinking, my penis had the power to throw me into hell. I mean, that's the truth of it, right? Wow. All right, yeah, so these are some powerful negative ideas. And hopefully we can start to break them down. The last reason I have here, this is not an exhaustive list, by the way, it's just things that I came up with, is that reason that religion tends to repress sexuality, is we're working with some outdated textbooks, outdated sexual ideas. The Ten Commandments, I mean, really, these religious texts are thousands of years old. Well, a lot of these ideas were when people really didn't know better, and patriarchy was the norm, or we didn't know anything about biology or evolution, and it was just like, well, homosexuality didn't make sense to people. They didn't know. I mean, all kinds of things like that. So from these textbooks, we learn that virgin births are a thing. Muhammad marries a 9-year-old girl, and that's great. It's all good. Homosexuality is against human and animal nature. The soul enters an embryo at conception. Still huge religious moral legislation in our land. Battles being fought over that all the time. And abortion issues are largely around religious legislation today. Menstruation is caused by an illness. During menstruation, a woman is ritually unclean and can't go into the temple in the Old Testament because of that. She might defile people, apparently. No nudity, modesty, sexual slavery is commanded, a killing of gays is commanded, and forced sexual mutilation, circumcision. Circumcision, by the way, is cutting off a highly functional part of a man's penis. Very sensitive, very functional, not just a piece of skin, to devote his body and soul to the deity Yahweh. That's what circumcision means in its religious roots. And that's the norm in America. Why? These outdated sex textbooks. And think about this, like, if we were teaching about gender equality or women's rights, what if we were forced to use a textbook on family values from Puritan society? What would happen to our teaching? We'd really have to stretch things to make our teaching right. And the reality is that when we embrace these textbooks that are full of these immoral teachings, people are going to believe them. Even if most people know that they're not moral. It's just that as long as these are propounded as the Word of God, they're going to spread. These ideas are going to continue. And I'd like to suggest that if something is abusive, a teaching, anywhere it's found, I don't care where it is, it's not God. It can't be abuse and of God at the same time. So with these sexual textbooks, these ideas are spread to the culture, and they create a culture of shame, of sexual shaming. There's something known as purity culture in evangelical Christianity. You're familiar with purity culture? So some of us might be. All right. Right here is a picture of a purity ball or a purity pageant. I've never been to one, but apparently these are pretty common in the South. You see these women carrying a cross. They're in their wedding dresses, and they're handed purity rings. They're told to devote themselves to Jesus. Jesus is your lover. Jesus is your boyfriend until you get married, and then your sexuality can be practiced in that context. And these services go on in churches all the time, all across the nation. I've been in these services, not the purity pageant, but we were taught to commit ourselves to be pure to Jesus, and we were given these purity rings, or we had the option of getting one, and you would give it to your spouse when you got married. So it's this teaching, abstinence is purity. So repression is made into a virtue. And what happens is we're defining purity and sexual morality by its exact opposite. The message has been completely reversed. I can't think of anything more sexually immoral than calling people bad for being sexual. But this is called sexual morality. It's totally flipped on its head. And in this culture, we have words like losing your virginity. Why do we lose something when we have sex? Why aren't we stepping into something or stepping into our power, our humanity? What's up with that? And there's all this vocabulary like purity, fornication, adultery, whore, slut, unfaithfulness, falling into sin, temptation, lewd. These are all religious words. Flipping purity on its head. And purity is being true to yourself. That's what I think it is. Purity, sexual morality, is about living in integrity. Being our genuine selves. The abstinence is part of this indoctrination. Religion's war on sex. Just say no to sex. And abstinence-only campaigns are going on in schools all around. And a lot of places are fighting to take away sex education and replace it with abstinence-only education. Because there's a fear that if you teach people about sex, they might actually have sex. Well, guess what? They're already having sex. They just feel really horrible about it in themselves. So what ends up happening, according to many studies, is when there's no sex education and when there's abstinence education, people don't end up being abstinent, but they do end up having more babies. They do end up getting more STDs. Teen pregnancies happen a lot. So this thing, it's really damaging to our society. And I knew so many people in my church growing up, so many teenagers who ended up had babies just because they didn't know what was going on. Like teenagers can't communicate about condoms or birth control because they already shouldn't be doing it. How are we going to talk about it? And even if we wanted to, we don't know how. I mean, I had to learn when I was like in my late 20s about condoms. It's pretty embarrassing to ask at some point. I mean, right? But this is real. And then sex is dangerous. We're also often taught that if you end up having sex, you're probably going to get AIDS or some horrible STD. It's like really, really dangerous. I mean, true, you can get these things, but this is why we have sex education. So True Love Waits is a campaign. They have a lot of good marketing. It's this massive branding campaign that's going on that you wait for your spouse to be anything sexual. And I like to say, love is my religion. I guess I've become a real Californian now. So a lot of indoctrination happens during puberty and adolescence, really when we're growing up at a young age. And we're very impressionable. And I don't know, adolescence was really miserable for me. I don't know about you. It was just this horrible, torturous experience. I mean, it's already hard enough going through puberty, right? Like, it's really awkward. I have all these new feelings for people, and get rejected, and don't know what to do, really nervous. And then that's hard enough to have all these raging hormones, and now all of a sudden you can go to hell. You have to fight it. In this indoctrination, sex is framed as an addiction. As an addiction. We have masturbation and pornography. They're taught like they're addictions that we need to get better from. We need to find a way, coping skills, to not be sexual. Was anyone part of an accountability group or have an accountability partner in this room? Okay. So I don't know how much these exist in other religions, or I assume there's something like them. But what they are is basically groups of people meet together, or our partners keep each other accountable to not have sex. So they meet up and confess often all of their sexual fantasies or behavior to each other. And I think that now that this is like really hilarious, because there's a kind of mental masturbation happening. Like, this is like the only appropriate place to talk about sex besides saying it's bad. And so people are all going into this great detail about their sex lives, and I'm like, hey guys, you don't realize what you're really doing here. But So it's taught like it's an addiction. And I remember when I was in one of the Christian cults I was a part of after college, I lived with a group of guys, and we had this policy. We would call each other up whenever we had a nocturnal emission. We had a fantasy in our dream, so that's still a sin. Or any sexual thought, and say, can you pray for me? We confess it to them and pray that God will help me not to do this, not to have this. And like going 30 days without masturbating was like the goal, because that's how long it takes to make or break an addiction, according to some expert that I don't agree with. But it's taught like it's an addiction. It's like an Alcoholics Anonymous for people who are sexual, which just so happens to be everybody. It's miserable. And the one-itis. I had the one-itis for a very long time. Waiting for the one. It's taught that we were to wait for the one, but we couldn't wait, so a lot of people end up rushing into marriage. When I was in Wheaton College, I knew so many friends who were just jumped into marriage with the first person they were in a relationship with because they just wanted to have sex. And it doesn't make for a good marriage. I was waiting for the perfect man. So what's the impact here? Well, 95% of Americans have sex before they're married. And divorce rates are roughly the same between conservative religious people and people who are not religious. So what ended up happening is people behave roughly the same sexually, or at some point they engage in sexual activity, even if less. And what ends up happening is living a double life. Embracing dishonesty and guilt. And secular people can usually live more openly. They can negotiate and communicate about sexuality, experiment, maybe even enjoy experimenting and thinking about other people, whereas religious people can't be honest in this system. And it can be torturous. It can be this total cognitive dissonance, this battle. So it's okay to come out of the closet about sexuality, and I think it's time for people to embrace sexuality. And interestingly enough, in religion, even as a heterosexual person, there can be this experience of coming out. I'm being sexual now. I remember that this happened for me, is that I ended up starting to embrace my sexuality and being honest, like I'm being sexual, and got a lot of pushback. A lot of shaming from people. People are shunned all the time. Uh-oh, they've fallen into sin. They're a bad person. They're not a Christian anymore. Just because they're embracing their sexuality. Speaking of coming out, homosexuality or non-heterosexuality in any form of behavior that doesn't fit within heterosexuality. There's an ongoing debate within religious traditions. Is sex okay or is it a sin? I don't accept that language. It's beautiful. It's amazing. It's wonderful. But it was almost illegal. I mean, it was illegal until just a couple years ago. It was illegal in this country to be gay. And I think now, like, it's an amazing time in our history because gay kids have the chance to grow up in school for the first time and maybe not be terrorized and abused in horrible ways. And probably they still will, but maybe not as badly as before. Just now, this is just recent. And homosexuality is found in over 1,500 animal species. Homophobia is found in only one, which is more natural, which is more unnatural. But where do these teachings come from? Is homosexuality disgusting? Have you heard this? It's disgusting. Well, this comes from Leviticus. Do not have sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman. That is detestable. It's disgusting. Is homosexuality unnatural? According to the Apostle Paul, women abandoned normal relationships with women and men natural relations with with women, and ended up having sex with each other. This is this unspiritual evil thing, unnatural thing. And I wonder if and hopefully when this becomes normative and accepted in our culture, hopefully people won't think that it's disgusting or weird in any way. It's, oh, this is great. But this indoctrination here, this programming. Conversion therapy. Probably people in this room have had some experiences, or at least you probably know someone who's undergone conversion therapy. And this is a therapy that is an attempt to change someone's sexual orientation because it's sinful. 698,000 Americans have gone through conversion therapy who are living. There's going to be about 77,000 more before they turn 18. And something, I think it's about 20 to 22,000 by licensed professional counselors in this country, by professional therapists. Conversion therapy is happening. And this is really sad. Additionally, LGBTQ and other non-binary trans people are 8 times more likely to commit suicide if they're raised in highly religious homes. This is according to a very recent study by the Williams Institute at the University of California, Los Angeles. So, religious words can kill. And that's what's happening. And then I think about it, who else is telling people that these words, it's not okay to be gay, or that it's wrong? I don't know who else, where else is this coming from? It's largely being preached from religious pulpits. National judgment. There's also, this is part of why the religious right is so adamant about the issues of homosexuality and abortion. Those 2 issues. Because there's a teaching that they can bring about God's judgment through foreign invasion and war and exile. Because this is what happened to Israel in the Old Testament. And this is taught in the book of Jude in the New Testament. Sodom and Gomorrah were these towns that rebelled against God, specifically because of sexual immorality and specifically with homosexuality. And because of this, and also because of genocide, and abortion is considered genocide, this mass murder that's happening. So these 2 issues, homosexuality and genocide, it's taught in churches, and probably other places, can bring about the invasion of the United States of America and domination by foreign countries. I had heard this. There's specifically a place called the International House of Prayer, IHOP in Kansas, an organization called The Call, a guy named Lou Engle. He fills up stadiums and preaches around the country that people should come to national repentance, has these huge, massive rallies, campaigning against the issue, campaigning against gay rights and abortion, and teaching that national judgment will happen if we don't pray and if we don't change our legislation. So that's the stakes here for people. That's why people are so adamant about these 2 issues. There's a movie, a documentary I recommend watching if you're interested, called God Loves Uganda, about that organization and about them sending missionaries to Africa to campaign against gay rights and contraception. And it shows the devastation that this is having on these African nations. So this is happening. Female shaming. A lot of people end up leaving religion because they're women. No other reason. In some ways, God might be called the deification of patriarchy. God is this authoritarian male ruler. God has a penis in Jesus. I mean, the Bible was written by men for men. And women are considered property. That's the main category of women in Scripture. And in the New and Old Testaments, you have the 10 Commandments. I don't know if you've read this in the 10 Commandments. It says, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his ox or donkey or slave or property, or anything else that he owns, that belongs to him. So a woman is a property of a man right alongside his donkey and his ox and his slave. This is in the highest courts of our country, this document. This patriarchal law. Because that's the way it was. Wives are commanded to submit their bodies to their husbands, like sex is a service on demand. And they should be available to their husbands under any condition. Women who have a lot of sex partners are considered sluts. They're blamed if sex happens for causing a man to be tempted. They're commanded in scriptures to not wear jewelry or makeup because that might cause sex and it's their fault if that happens. Women find salvation in bearing children. It says this. This is in the Bible. They get saved because their role is to have kids. They're to be silent in church. Rape is legitimized in the Bible. There's 3 extended rape metaphors in the Old Testament where God explicitly says he's an abusive spouse. He uses rape metaphors to talk about his relationship with his people. As an abusive lover would be. He basically says to Israel, I'm angry, you're going to suffer for it, you're a whore, you deserve to be raped, I'm going to let you be gang raped by the foreign nations, and this is going to be a lesson to you and all the other slutty women like you. This is what these passages literally say. And then there's sex slavery in the Judeo-Christian scriptures as well. So my suggestion is that we embrace what we could call the divine feminine. I mean, maybe we should pick a female god. And there's someone named Asherah, and she appears in the Bible, and she goes under different names in a lot of ancient religions. This is very, very interesting research. We found an inscription archaeologically. It says Yahweh and his Asherah. In ancient times, Israel used to be a polytheistic religion. They had a pantheon of many gods before it was consolidated into monotheistic religion under one God. And it looks like, from archaeological evidence, that Asherah was the divine consort of Yahweh. That God had a female counterpart in ancient times. And she was known as the Queen of Heaven. This appears in the Bible. And we see her being worshipped in the Old Testament, in the book of Kings and Chronicles. And but what happens is the kings are commanded to slaughter all these other deities. So they kill her priests and they tear down her Asherah poles, it says. And so her worship is obliterated. And then the Israelite religion and Islam and Christianity and Judaism end up being ruled by a male deity. The female deity is taken out of the picture entirely. And sacred sexuality happened to be a part of her worship too. This is very fascinating research. It's out there. These Western religions don't really have any divinity with femininity represented there. And so basically, Yahweh, this deity, was an abusive patriarchal man. And what place does he have in a world that is already fighting patriarchy on so many fronts and that so badly needs women to be elevated and honored? And I mean, in all these ways. And I'm sure many of us have had some difficult experiences with these issues. So I want us to just take a couple minutes, maybe talk to a couple other people, and just share something that strikes you maybe from your experience or a message that you heard, or you can just listen if you want, or whatever you're comfortable with. But we're just going to take a couple minutes to give you some time to talk amongst yourselves, so just 2 or 3 other people. I want to address something that I hear a lot. People will say, tell me this was just your experience, and I'm sorry you had a bad experience. And to me, that's victim silencing and victim blaming and shaming. Well, yes, it was my experience, and that shouldn't be minimized. But what I'm talking about, again, I'm coming back to scriptures. I'm reading these books. And so these experiences are being replicated because they're based on ideologies. And people can take these kinds of conversations as personal attacks. And that makes sense because they're personally held beliefs. But I think we have to be able to hear when someone is talking about being abused. The proper response is really to shut up and listen. Say, am I somehow complicit in this? Did I contribute to it? Or, oh, you've been abused. Like, I want to hear you speak. Instead of viewing it as a personal attack and threat. But I understand that minimization that happens. Because there's a perceived threat. So is your God a sexually abusive lover? For a lot of people, a relationship with God looks like an abusive relationship. Jesus is my boyfriend is a teaching. Song of Solomon is often taught as an allegory for the love of God, like a romantic lover. Like, let Jesus kiss me with the kisses of his mouth. It's taught like we have this romantic sexual relationship with this deity who owns our bodies. God owns our bodies and our spirits and our souls. A foreign deity, an outside spirit, we ask this outside spirit to come into our lives and take control of our lives and our hearts. It's a divine possession that takes place, and we become the possession of someone else, no longer our own. It says, do you not know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit who is in you? You are not your own. You were bought with a price. Honor God with your body. Your body isn't your own. It's God's. And so to me, I think this looks like sexual abuse, an abusive relationship. The nature of abusive relationships is that they're not all bad. There's a mixture of good and bad, and it's the mixture that's confusing. If this was all bad, if it was all judgment and threats, no one would stay in it. But as it is, a lot of times people have trouble getting out of abusive relationships because, well, maybe the guy's a good guy. He's a good guy. He loves me. He's nice. He gives me money. I mean, maybe these are things that happen. But every so often he says, I'm going to kill you if you leave. Who's saying this? We're hearing the same thing here. And that's where the abuse takes root. Because of this confusing mixture of positivity and negativity. So for some people, maybe the thing that they need to do is to step out of these environments where the abuse is happening. Maybe consider a different religion or a different teacher or step outside of it. I don't know. But I think this can look awfully like an abusive human relationship. Sexual oppression, this can cause sexual disorders. It can be physical abuse. I mean, look at the Catholic Church, the pedophilia that's happening. And there's a lot of physical abuse that happens. But most of what we're focusing on, which I think is the more widespread thing, is the psychological, spiritual, sexual abuse. Psychiatric disorders, anxiety disorders, depression, performance anxiety. This is horrible for me. A lot of people who I work with talk about this issue is when you haven't had sex your whole life, and then all of a sudden you start having sex with people who have 30 or 40 years of experience. That can be terrifying. Sometimes it's easier to just shut down and avoid it altogether than to deal with all this. To just shut it all down. You can get a guilt complex. So we feel so guilty about who we are and about everything that we do. It's like just guilty all the time. Sexual dysfunction. Trouble with relationships. Trouble dating. Trouble relating. Singleness, lonely, difficulty finding a partner. Divorce and remarriage are forbidden by Jesus in the New Testament. So people who go through divorces have to be lonely the rest of your life. Or you can't get divorced because that's a sin. So you got to stay with someone when it's not going to work. Submission. It's interesting, a lot of religions incorporate very submissive postures. Kneeling and bowing your head, prayer. And the suppression of sexual energy is a kind of submission. And sex is not just about the physicality of it. It's sexuality. It's this basic life stuff we have in us. And I think when we stifle that energy, it affects our careers, our relationships, our social life, our creative energy, our creative life force. So it's much broader than just the physical aspect of it. So what do we do to heal sexually? What do we do to reclaim sexuality? My first advice for people who are struggling, especially with performance anxiety or difficulty having orgasm, which is really, really common with this. I hear people say all the time, like, I've never had an orgasm, or I can't because of this guilt and these issues. There's something wrong with my body. My advice is have bad sex. Have really bad, horrible sex. If we're having trouble having good sex, might as well go all the way and just make it really bad. Say to your partner, can we please have awful sex? Like, this is not orgasm, nothing, just like, try to make it the worst you can. And it's kind of funny, but the point is taking the pressure off. And that when we're trying so hard to make something happen, that's the opposite of what it's about. And when it becomes less about performance and more about connection, enjoying feelings and sensation, the rest of the stuff tends to work. That's just a piece of advice. And this is part of this. Associate sex with love and unconditional love. Word we hear a lot. Unconditional love and acceptance, connection. These positive things, they're what sexuality is really about. Maybe a lot of us have to find partners who are able to be accepting, who are able to understand and rewire our brains again, because we're coming from a frame where sex was associated with judgment and fear and self-rejection. Non-monogamy or variety in monogamy. The point here isn't to promote any kind of way of being in relationship, but that, there are options out there. And really 99% of our sex lives happen outside of marriage. This whole system ends up being based on denial. Because we're thinking about other people and other things all the time. And it's mostly in our thoughts. So even it's kind of a joke that this is all within marriage. But what do we do with those thoughts? There's a whole range of varieties. So instead of people going out and having affairs because they lie to each other and can't be honest, it's all bad, we'll maybe explore variety, maybe other people, or maybe just variety in what you do. There's all kinds of different ways of expression. The world is your oyster in a way. Write a sexual autobiography. This is something that I did when I was in seminary, when I was going through this. I remember I was so angry. The whole thing was just like me raging at God and everybody. It was just, it's like, this is horrible. But I actually ended up writing another one later on. And I saw how much I'd healed and grown. Now, this is going to be a very healing practice. Experiment. Have fun. Enjoy yourself. We're free. It's a really great thing. Exposure. I remember that I was triggered all the time whenever I heard anyone talk about sex or I saw it in a movie, because I think too a lot of the reason why a lot of ministers or preachers tend to ramp so much on sexuality is because they're jealous, because they can't have it. But so I started watching films with sex scenes in them and just doing it over and over until I got comfortable with it and I stopped getting triggered. There's kind of some exposure therapy there. Therapist or a sex coach or someone you can talk to. This is probably the most important thing, I think, is getting professional help. We're dealing with some really deep core wounds that go to the core of our identity and years of our lives. So have patience, be kind to yourself. Really, really, this, again, was years of indoctrination, usually. And so it can take some time to unwind that and to work through these things. And that's normal and that's okay. And everyone has trauma. And this is to be respected for what that is. Heal religious trauma and shame. This issue is much broader than sexuality. All these things are bound up together. Other abusive doctrines like original sin, like hell, like giving up your power, all kinds of different issues. And shame. Shame is really, I think, the core here, is shame. Shame and judgment. So working through shame, learning, repairing the self-relationship, the parts of myself that I've shut off or are viewed as bad, reintegrating those. Experience sex as something spiritual. And there's a whole spiritual tradition called Tantra that's based around the idea that sex and desire can be used as a means to experience the divine or deeper aspects of our humanity. So we can start to embrace these things and see the beauty of them. That's one option. And find your creative outlet. This is a backwards way of getting about it, but it's very powerful because, again, sexuality is about this life creative energy that expresses itself in acting in our power, in creating, in expressing life. It's the expression of life working through us. So finding the way in which you create, I think, can help us to reconnect with that sexual power and reintegrate it. And please, if you are in a helping profession or whatever profession you are, we need more research and more training. These issues are so broad and so vast and so commonplace, but I just know a handful of professionals who are doing research in this area. Just a handful. I mean, I'm talking to people all the time, all over the world about these issues. It's just, I don't know why. Maybe it's because it's scary to talk about religion, or it's just been accepted as this good thing that abuse can't happen there. I don't know. And this is part of what I'm working to do, studying here for my doctorate too, is working on researching religious trauma, and I want to start a training program for helping professionals for continuing education credit and beyond that, so we can learn about these issues. Because one of the things I hear over and over again from people I speak with going through a transition is my therapist doesn't have a clue. No idea what's going on, no idea how to deal with these issues. Or it's just like, oh, you're leaving a religion, that must be difficult. Really doesn't understand how massive these issues are. We need to raise awareness. What is sexual morality? So what then? We don't have this legislation or these books. What is it? Well, I know what it's not. I know it's not a system of rules. I know it's not shaming people for the way that they're born. And it's not about all these negative things. I think we can take a tip from Jesus here. It says, love your neighbor as yourself. And that's a good place to start with sexual morality. And really, sexual morality is pretty simple. Consent, communication, respect, safety. Some basic principles. I think that covers most of our basics. It's about integrity. It's really surprisingly simple. So again, this is within the broader issue of healing religious trauma, and that's my work, that's my focus. I'm going to be offering another workshop sometime in February or March. If you're interested, I have a mailing list there to sign up for it. It's going to be covering the broader issues. I mean, I don't know why I'm taking on an even more massive topic, but I mean, issues like original sin, fear of hell, being shunned or losing family and community, talking to one's former community, rebuilding, acclimating to life in secular society. There's just a vast array of issues. So, heads up for that one. And sign up for my blog and my email list. I'm probably just going to email you about events. But I have hundreds of pages of articles that I've written on religious trauma, on all kinds of topics, and on spirituality, on exploring spirituality after religion and psychedelics and sexuality. So if you're interested and want some resources, I have a lot, and I have podcasts on there as well where I talk about those various topics, and more coming out. And I also offer coaching related to religious transition, healing religious trauma. And for the people in the YouTube world, I love to put on workshops and speak at events or do whatever, anything I can do to help. So, thank you for coming to Reclaiming Sexuality from Religion.